Test, test, test. Test, test, test. Okay. Test, test, test. Okay. Sounds like it's working. So today we are talking about strategy, and then on Thursday you will have the last critical thinking challenge. I've actually posted it, so you'll have some time at the end to organize and do that if you want. Let's see if I can get this to come on. See if the projection will work. And make sure that this is still working. That is still working. All right, so we're going to tie it all together today. We're going to wrap up by talking about marketing strategy. And then I'll give you your last critical thinking challenge for the semester. And then next week will be finals. So this is pulling all of these things that we've talked about, all these concepts, into sort of an overall and how we proceed with engaging in effective marketing from a perspective. Now, one of the things that you can think about, and one of the challenges that I used to do, and you might think about doing, I have modified my last challenge because in a world of AI, I think it's important that you do that. But in thinking about how you can apply this to yourself, I used to assign a project called Develop a Self-Marketing Plan for the end of semester, but it's not really a group project. And I wanted you to have experience with AI, since that is going to be a huge disruptive technology that will be really, really important. So I wanted you to get as much experience using AI and implementing it into marketing as you can. But developing a self-marketing plan is not a bad idea. So when you leave this class, you can go out and develop a self-marketing plan into how you're going to go out into the world of work and become successful. And that's strategic marketing. So the basics for success that we have to have in order to have a good marketing organization, one that relies on all of these concepts that we've talked about, these sort of benchmark practices throughout the course of the semester, is one that both devises and maintains focus, understanding what it is that you do, that your competitive advantage is, and maintains focus on that while also being flexible, which is hard to do. And one of the seminal works in marketing in the early ages was an article by Theodore Levitt where he talks about marketing myopia and organizations that became, and I mentioned this, I think, at the beginning of the semester, that became myopic in their perspective. And so if you went back in time, for example, to the beginning of the 20th century and the start of the Industrial Revolution, some of the largest companies in the United States were railroad companies. And a lot of those companies went broke because they were really good at being railroad companies, but they failed to understand what the larger context was, which was that they were actually logistics companies, transportation companies. And as shipping and airplanes came into prominence, they lost out. And so it is maintaining focus and understanding that, but also being flexible. And that is really hard to do both things at once, to hold two things in your mind at the same time. Then executing on these well-developed strategies is absolutely important, right? And you have to have a culture that is willing to do that. And in large organizations, a lot of times, this can be very difficult to do. One of the things that higher education, for example, struggles with is understanding what it is that students need. In the highly technologically sophisticated world, why is it, for example, that we're still insisting that you have to take, 2 semesters of history? And I think probably taking an American National Government course is useful because you're going to operate in a system of laws under a nation of politics and rules and governance. And so, but why do you need to know, what happened in, the summer of 1812? when you can probably look that up fairly quickly on Google. Why is that necessary? And so adapting to change can be very, very difficult, particularly in institutions that have been around for a long time, which is why companies, well, even companies that have been around for a long time may fail. So creating a culture that is performance-oriented and accepts that, and then building structures that are fast, flexible, and flat. Historically speaking, what we have seen is organizations that are exceedingly hierarchical. And Max Weber, a German sociologist, said these were the ideal organizations, right? Because they were hierarchical in that lower levels reported to upper levels. And, down here you have your little workers, and here you have, line managers, and then directors, and then, VPs, and finally the CEO. And this is a very sort of rigid structure. Organizations that are now successful and are able to compete in a rapidly changing environment have flattened out that structure, or attempted to flatten out that structure. Now that gets complicated once the organization gets really, really big. One of the things that made Facebook able to be a disruptive technology and come in was at the beginning, it was just a few people working on designing a program for a social network. And now it's become this, sort of behemoth organization. And as you get larger, it gets harder to keep that organization flat and lean. But to the extent that it's possible, you need to do that, because the flatter the organization, the more you're going to be able to adapt to change, and the less you're going to be removed from the people who are actually doing sort of the work that you need to get done. So allocating resources. Business doesn't do anything that doesn't cost money. And so allocating resources becomes critical. And you have to maximize these resources such that you increase revenue and decrease costs. And that's one of the reasons why I focused so much on this semester on getting you exposed to AI, because AI has the potential for decreasing an enormous amount of costs, particularly human capital. Now that's going to be cruel in some respects, right? Because it's going to replace a lot of jobs. One of the things that I was reading about was a guy who's writing programming, and he was coming up with like software that he's like launching, and he's doing it very quickly using AI to write the code. Stuff that would have taken months or a year to develop, they can now write enormously quickly. So converting marketing information into action. So planning, looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that we talked about when we did environmental scanning, setting goals, and then developing your marketing program, implementing that program, and then evaluating whether or not you've been successful and making changes where those changes are necessary is going to be critical for organizations in the future. And it's going to be critical as you think about it for yourself. And as I said, I really struggled with whether or not to eliminate at the end of the semester the self-marketing plan, but there's only so many things that I can assign at the end of the semester without you like revolting because you've got other classes and stuff that you've got to work on as well. And I recognize that. And so I swapped out the self-marketing plan for developing a marketing plan using AI so that you get familiar with those resources. But thinking about this in terms of your own, what do you need to do to maintain strategic relevance in the workforce today? What kinds of skills are you going to have to learn and be able to implement in a workforce that is changing enormously quickly? So the planning phase, long-term versus short-term. Now, one of the things that a lot of foreign businesses have been critical in the past of US businesses is that US businesses have oftentimes focused on short-term goals. And one of the reasons for that is particularly, and this happened in the company that I worked for, companies that are publicly traded have to report their financials quarterly and then at the end of the year. So 10Qs and 10Ks, we had to report those at quarterly intervals and then the end of the year. And that really trains you to focus on short term. And a lot of other companies from foreign countries, particularly during the 1980s and 1990s, Japanese companies were pretty critical of the American corporate culture that focused on these really, really short-term, quarter-over-quarter kind of strategy and goals. Because if you're maximizing what is revenue quarter-over-quarter, you may be sacrificing long-term revenue. And this happened again in the company that I worked for at the end of the quarter, because he knew we were going to have to put out to our investors a 10Q. Our CEO would start pressuring our sales force to go out and sell. And maybe if you made a sale that was less than ideal because you were trying to meet a quarter-end goal, you sacrificed a long-term potential if you had a customer that ultimately ended up unsatisfied with the solution that you presented. Did you have a question? Okay, sorry. I apologize for not seeing your hand go up faster. So long range are usually 2 to 5 years, and these originate at the chief marketing officer level, and they're directed towards the CEO and the CFO. Annual marketing plans are developed usually by marketing or product managers, and they focus on sales and budgeting. And there are 2 ways that we can do this. We can go with generic business strategies, which employ either a cost leadership, which is lower prices and targeting at a broad array of segments, or differentiation, which requires significant points of difference between your product. At the beginning of class, again, so a lot of this is a review, I said that differentiation may be the most important word in marketing today. Everything is highly differentiated. And throughout the course of this semester, I've given you examples of that. And I started out with, just over the course of my lifetime, focusing on things that are pretty basic, like milk. When I was a kid, there was sort of 2 types of milk. There was whole milk and skim milk, and that was it. And it was cow's milk. That is, it was the definition of milk. Now you've got soy milk, which is not milk. It may be soy juice, but it's not milk. But they call it milk because soy juice doesn't sound appealing when you put it on your cereal in the morning. And so we've got all of these, almond milk. It's not, almonds don't produce milk. It's almond something or other, right? I mean, what they're basically using the almonds for is as a thickener. And do you know how many almonds are in a gallon of almond milk? People think that there's a lot of almonds in that. It's not. It's literally a few almonds in an entire gallon of almond milk and a lot of other stuff, right? Because almonds don't even really produce any juice. It's pulverizing them to the point that they add a thickener, basically. So differentiation. So there's all kinds of points of differentiation, even in the most basic stuff like milk. And now the supermarkets are even differentiating again. When I was a kid growing up, eggs. Eggs were a staple for breakfast. Everybody had eggs and bacon for breakfast. And you went to the store and it was either white eggs or brown eggs. You can now get heirloom eggs at the grocery store that are different color. They are selling chickens. I went to Tractor Supply yesterday and they're selling a variety of chicken that they call Easter egg. And I don't think that's the actual name of the chickens, but they produce blue or green or speckled eggs rather than just your average white or brown eggs. I was in Dallas. I haven't seen this here in Edmond yet or Oklahoma City, but at the grocery stores in Dallas, they're now selling quail eggs. And that's become a thing. Have you seen a quail egg? It looks like about the size of a almond M&M. I can't imagine why anybody, wants, and they're selling duck eggs at the grocery store as well. So huge amounts of differentiation. So where are we going? Asking, are we getting there? And what time frame are we looking at? Are we looking at long range or annual plans? I think I got these out of out of sequence. So the generic business strategy, again, focuses on cost, lowering costs or reducing expenses to appeal to a broad array of segments or differentiation, as I suggested. Or you can have a cost focus where you control expenses, but you narrow the range of segments that you are going to focus on. So if you are doing a cost leadership versus cost focus, cost leadership, you're going to focus on a broad variety of segments. So a lot of different people and a lot of different groups. Whereas if you're doing a cost focus, you're going to try to control expenses, but you're going to focus on fewer segments in the market. What you want to do is, if you're cost focused, is you want to focus on building market share. So you may not have as many segments that you're appealing to, but you want to be highly competitive in those segments that you do appeal to. And then a differentiation focus versus a differentiation strategy is you have significant difference to target one or few segments. But again, what you're trying to do is increasing your market share in those segments so that you are sort of more competitive in those segments. Think about things like Starbucks versus McDonald's. They both sell a lot of the similar products, particularly in the morning. And Starbucks, of course, is now because people drink coffee throughout the day. When I was a kid, again, people drank coffee in the morning, and then they avoided coffee in the afternoon because they thought that caffeine would keep them awake, and it probably does. And they didn't drink coffee in the morning. So Starbucks competes heavily with McDonald's, but they appeal to a much smaller segment than McDonald's does, right? McDonald's is appealing to, they're trying to appeal to Starbucks, which is one of the reasons that McDonald's, if you look at old McDonald's from 10 or 15 years ago, which for most of you, that's a big chunk of your life, 10 or 15 years ago. But if you went back just 10 or 15 years, the way McDonald's looked was radically different than the way they look today. They've changed their look to look more like a Starbucks, and they've introduced stuff to try and be more. They're appealing to a broad segment, right? Because they do breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But their breakfast market, they started to lose market share to Starbucks. Starbucks is focused on a smaller markets or fewer market segments, but really trying to penetrate those markets. That's as opposed to, the generic is as opposed to a more specific or focused marketing strategy like the Blue Ocean strategy, where you simultaneously try to lower costs and differentiate on a 4-action grid. So eliminating unnecessary factors in your processes that are no longer important. Why is it? So again, if we think about higher education, why is it that we make you do things like in the undergraduate level, just as a question to throw out there, take PE. Why are we doing that? You had to take PE in junior high and high school, didn't you? Isn't that required in Oklahoma? If you haven't figured out that you either are going to exercise or not going to exercise by the time you get to college, I'm not sure that that's adding a lot of value for you. Why is it that we continue to do it? I don't know. I mean, maybe there is a good reason. And I'm sure that if I went over and I talked to the people in health, physical education, recreation, and flopping around, or dance, as they call it, they would explain to me where I'm going off the rails, but I really kind of doubt it. So eliminating unnecessary factors and creating factors that maybe have never been offered before. That's one of the reasons why in the marketing department in the College of Business, we are creating AI classes, because this is going to be important that we've never thought about offering. We used to teach, when I started teaching marketing years and years and years ago, for example, we offered a course called advertising. We no longer offer that course because advertising is a very limited idea of what it is to promote a business. We've changed the name of that to Integrated Marketing Communication, which focuses on not just advertising, but public relations, sales promotion, personal selling, social media, and now AI, in developing ways of reaching consumers that are new and novel. You've got to reduce factors that you can below industry norms that help you save money, and raise factors above industry norms in areas that are critical. One of the things that is critical as we think about where we're headed as an institution is providing students with relevant degree plans. One of the reasons that we developed the professional sales program in the Department of Marketing was this was a necessary thing that we realized that nobody else, for example, in the state at the time we did it, was doing this. OU and OSU did not have sales programs. We were the first to recognize that, like, this is a trend that's growing, and training people in becoming effective salespeople is really, really critical, because almost everybody's first job is going to be a sales job. It's going to be a sales job. No matter what you go into, you're probably going to have to sell. So the guidelines for planning and strategy. You have to have, and we talked about this before when we talked about goals, you have to have measurable and achievable goals. What is measurable? Well, can you prove or disprove the existence of God? That's going to be really hard to do, right? Is it achievable? Theoretically, yes, I guess, but it's going to be really, really hard, right? So measurable and achievable. If we can't measure it, how are we going to achieve it? And if it's way beyond, maybe we can measure it, but if it's way beyond our technical expertise, this happened in the company that I worked for. Our CEO would insist that we could produce titles just faster than we could produce them. We didn't have the technical expertise to produce them as quickly as he wanted to. So we could measure that, whether or not we produced the title, but it wasn't really realistic in the time frames that he would promise people that we could get things done. And that was a critically important failure in some instances of the products that we produced. You have to use base facts and valid assumptions. This is becoming increasingly more difficult as we look out in the environment, and there are an enormous amount of ways, and I have to do this constantly with my friends who constantly are coming up with things and telling me that, so-and-so said something. It's amazing how we can deep fake things, and it looks real with AI. So using base facts and valid assumptions about what's going on in the market. And as we have AI that's hallucinating things, that can be problematic. There have been, in my profession, there have been lawyers who used AI that was not filtering out, and it's hallucinating case citations. Turned out poorly for them because they just made up cases. ChatGPT will just make stuff up. So you have to, in an age in which we can get this stuff so quickly, but really wondering whether or not it is legitimate is going to be, even in programs that are designed. So I use the legal software in my legal practice that is supposed to not hallucinate. But do you think I absolutely 100% trust it? No. I mean, it's generating citations, and that's great, but I'm going to have to check those and make sure that it actually is accurate. You have to use an open and transparent process. If you don't tell your workforce, and lots of managers fail on this level, they are not transparent because they believe that information is power, and it is. And if they share too much, they think that somebody can take their job. What I would suggest to you is that A-level managers hire A+ employees that they can trust. B-level managers hire C-level employees because they're worried that they'll take their job. As you think about your own personal marketing plan, focus on how you can be an A-level employee. You need simple, clear, and specific actions that incorporate all of the key marketing mix factors: product, price, place, and promotion. You have to have flexibility while still maintaining control. And then a big portion at the corporate level of success is finding the right person to implement the plan that you come up with. Having a champion for that plan. Things that present problems that cause failure in planning and developing a marketing plan. Inaccurate assumptions about the environment. Again, as we are relying more and more on information that we can generate quickly, making sure that those assumptions about the environment are valid. If you're looking at growth in an industry, making sure that the statistics that you are seeing that is being generated enormously quickly by Google is accurate. Losing sight of customers' needs. This is easy to do in an age in which we have become increasingly more isolated because we all have this device that we're constantly addicted to. There was a book about 20 years ago that came out called Alone Together, and it presented this problem that we face. We're all engaged in these activities where we're with other people, but we're constantly having FOMO. And we're with our friends, and what are we doing? We're looking at the social media of other people because maybe they're having a better time. And understanding the customer's needs. If we rely completely on, the magic of stuff that we can produce that is enormously powerful with this, we can lose sight of what customers really care about. Think about if you actually, one of the things, so I'm trying to figure out how to switch from cable because I've finally gotten annoyed with the cable company to the point that I'm like looking for alternatives for internet because I don't really watch cable television all that much anymore. I watch everything on a streaming service or on YouTube TV, which is a lot cheaper than cable television. So I'm trying to figure out how to cut, so I'm like trying all these different services, going with, for example, my phone, my cell phone provider is now providing coverage, and they send you out the stuff, and I am not a technological genius, but I'm also not a technological Luddite, and trying to figure out how to set this stuff up. It's pretty easy, but when you run into problems, it would sure be nice to talk, and it takes 20 minutes to actually get to a real live human being. And I know that they think that the AI is working great, and maybe it will in the next year or two, but there are still aspects where it might be nice to talk to a real live human being. Spending too much time on data and developing plans that are too complex. And then finally, not engaging in an open and transparent process and having managers that basically feel no sense, or employees that feel no sense of ownership in what it is they're doing. So in the implementation, it is important to avoid analysis paralysis. You actually have to take, at some point in time, you have to make a decision. I can tell you that myself, I am infamous, and I gave you an example of this at the beginning of the semester. I think I talked about how what I would do when I would go buy something is start to put together a notebook on everything, and I gave you an example of we needed a new microwave, the microwave broke, and so I started to put together the notebook, and I came home one day, and Robin had bought a microwave. Why did you buy that microwave? Well, because it matched our other appliances? No, right? Well, she'd gotten tired of waiting for me to make a decision because I was bogged down in the details of all of the features that I thought we should consider when looking at microwaves, right? You got to surface problems immediately. If you're having problems, you need to address them quickly. Bring them to the surface in an open and transparent way. Ask for help. Again, this is one of the things that it's kind of human nature to want to feel like if I help people out, it might reflect poorly on me, or they might become better at it than I am. That's not going to work if you want to be highly competitive. Communicate goals and methods of achievement. Again, have a program champion and reward success. Don't punish failure. Business is highly volatile. It is highly risky. And all too often, people are afraid that if they take a chance, that they will be punished. Ultimately, if a business doesn't produce enough successes, they will fail. But you see this at companies like 3M, at least in the past, where 3M allowed people to go off, their scientists in the research and development labs, and work on projects that were not sponsored by the company. And some of those were miserable failures. One of the ones that they thought was going to be a miserable failure was this adhesive that just wasn't terribly adhesive. But when you put it on a piece of paper and you stick it to another piece of paper, you can pull that off. And it became called Post-its. And it was a huge, so what appeared to be a failure, but it was because 3M didn't punish people who came up. They didn't say, well, that's a horrible adhesive, you're fired. They found a new and an innovative use for that, what appeared to be a failure. So you have to identify and evaluation deviations from your goals, act on those deviations, which may mean that you need to cut bait and run. This is a fishing term. How many of you have gone fishing? A few of you. You know what cut bait and run means? At some point, if you get your lure stuck, you got to decide whether or not it's worth it to keep trying to pull that lure out or to cut it and run. Coca-Cola had to do this with New Coke, one of the largest companies at the time in the world. The number one at that point in time, the number one brand value was Coca-Cola, launches this product called New Coke, miserable failure, had to cut it and run and dump the product. So act on those deviations, and using marketing dashboards is going to be critical in helping you evaluate that and getting that kind of data. All right, so what you're going to do and you're going to have the rest of class today and then all of Thursday, is you're going to assume that you are, like you have for the entire semester, working for Loves. You're going to use AI to develop a long-range marketing plan for Loves that integrates the EV charging stations. Once it generates, and it should generate that, I generated a marketing plan just to test this out this morning. It should generate it in 30 seconds or less, depending on the AI tool that you use. Discuss what it's missing and how it could be improved. Any questions? No. All right, everything's clear. You know what we're doing at this point. So no one got any ducks because I was too busy yapping myself this morning. So I'll end the stream and you guys can work on that on your projects.